Senator, you're the ranking Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee. Tell me, what is the Senate Intelligence Committee?
Well, the Senate Intelligence Committee was set up in the late 1970s. At that period, the intelligence community, the CIA and others, had been involved in activities that frankly were not legal or moral or ethical in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. So a Senate investigation ensued, and then out of that came two oversight committees, the Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committee. They're generally try to be the most bipartisan committees in the Senate. We normally operate behind closed doors, and part of our responsibility is to oversee the CIA, parts of the FBI, the various other spy agencies that are part of the United States government.
All right, the Senate side of this Intelligence Committee, not the House side, but the Senate side, concluded that Russia did meddle in the 2016 election. Is that correct?
Well, even the House, I think, agreed that Russia clearly intervened in our elections. What we knew was that the Russians intervened. We knew they did three things. They hacked into both political parties. They favored, and this is where the House doesn't agree, but our committee bipartisan agrees, they interfered in the election to try to help Mr. Trump and hurt Hillary Clinton. They also scanned or broke into 21 of our state's electoral systems, and they massively used social media, things like Facebook and Twitter, in ways to sow dissension and again try to advance Russian needs over American needs.
Now, does the House committee have the same information the Senate committee has?
Well, the House committee's had a different process. I don't like to be critical of anyone. They have been much more partisan since day one, and for Americans, and for that matter people around the world, to follow all the ins and outs. If this breaks down on a partisan basis, then people will lose confidence in our results. And that's why, on the Senate side at least, both me as the ranking Democrat and Richard Burr as the ranking Republican, we've tried to stick to the facts, try to operate in a bipartisan way, and so far, over a year into the investigation, we've managed to accomplish that.
How do you reconcile the fact with the same information that the House has a different conclusion on that particular issue, as whether the Russians are trying to favor President Trump over Secretary of State Hillary Clinton? Is that just the partisan nature?
Well, in the House, clearly the Democrats felt that the Russians were trying to help Mr. Trump. It was the Republicans in the House who were the only ones who felt that it wasn't necessarily to help Mr. Trump.
Looking at the same information that you have?
I think it is absolutely conclusive. We had a hearing today reviewing the assessment of the intelligence community, and the responsibility of the intelligence community is always to speak truth to power, not to be political. The intelligence community leadership under both President Obama and under President Trump have all agreed with the assessment that came out in January of 2017 that laid out this case, and specifically laid out the case that the highest levels of the Russian government ordered this intervention in the American elections, and ordered it on the behalf of trying to help Mr. Trump and hurt Clinton.
All right. Your committee has not yet reached the question, at least publicly, whether or not there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. I take it that's something that you're still investigating, or you intend to release a conclusion on that?
We've still got additional witnesses to see. This is taking longer than I would have expected, but the truth is, in many ways, we have more lines of inquiry or more stories that have come to light today than even 7 or 8 months ago. We had, for example, the intelligence community leaders from the Obama administration in today, and reasserting that their conclusions that the Russians, again, intervened, helped Trump, hurt Clinton, but they acknowledged that, a year or so ago at this moment in time, they were not aware, for example, of the now infamous Trump Tower meeting where Mr. Trump Jr. and Mr. Kushner and others met with a Russian lawyer / agent of the Russian government to talk about immigration, but also to talk about dirt on Hillary Clinton.
All right, then, and the Senate Judiciary Committee has just released documents related to the Donald Trump Jr.
Yes, that very meeting.
That very meeting. Have you had a chance to look at those documents?
I've not looked at the Senate Judiciary Committee documents, but we have had the chance to interview Mr. Trump Jr. So we have our own evidence, but our approach has been not to release testimony, not to be fully, forward-leaning on all these items until we finish the investigation. I mean, that's good legal practice, that's good investigatory practice, and to not reach final conclusions on an issue such as the one that's the hottest on collusion until we finish our work.
So how do you explain, though, that, and I realize it's not your committee, it's Senate Judiciary Committee releasing those documents? I mean, how do people watching this think, well, why is one Senate Intelligence Committee saying we don't release those documents? The Senate Judiciary Committee says we do release those documents.
Well, it may be that Senate Judiciary has ended up, and I've not followed all of this, but they may have ended up concluding they're done with their investigation as well. Unfortunately, on the Senate Judiciary Committee, there's been a lot of partisan dissension as well. Not as bad as the House, but there has been some partisan divides. And so, what we've tried to do, and we've got people that are very liberal and very conservative on our committee, we've tried to say, if we're going to have the credibility that we want with the American people, and for that matter, because the world is watching as well, we want to make sure as much as possible we get agreement on facts. So we've had agreement on facts of what the Russians did. We've had agreement on facts on how they use social media. We've had agreement on facts on the fact that we need to increase our election security. We've still got the open questions and work to do around collusion. And my hope is that our investigations, similar to Mr. Mueller's investigation, who is the special prosecutor, that we will come out with the same conclusions, because at the end of the day, I think that will, again, the most important thing is get out the truth and not divide on a partisan basis.
Why is it taking so long, or seemingly so long? Is the volume of material, the complexity, or other schedule? I mean, this has been dogging the Trump administration.
It's not. The fact is, if more people, particularly affiliated with Mr. Trump, had been a little more forthcoming in the early days of the administration. Mr. Trump constantly says there's no there, but the Mueller investigation has a number of guilty pleas, a number of indictments. We came out today and reasserted the fact that our conclusion was that the Russians had intervened actually to help Mr. Trump and hurt Clinton. So if there was no there, I wish the president and his allies would work closer with all these investigations. We're working through that process, but as you know from your legal background, some of these things take time if you're going to actually get them right.
Well, so the key question, I guess, remains, at least for your committee, and I don't mean to speak for you, is whether there's collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, or Russia and the Trump campaign. And is the Trump administration, or the witnesses who are on the campaign, are they fully cooperating with you, or do you have some who are dragging their feet or not responding?
Well, we've had some individuals that we would either want to talk to or might want to bring back and talk to again, who become subjects of Mr. Mueller's criminal investigation. Our investigation is not a criminal investigation. Our investigation is, as our responsibility to oversee the intelligence community, is to make sure, was our intelligence community aware of what was happening? How do we make sure, whether it's Russia or some other foreign entity, on a going forward basis, never interferes again? Ours is a counterintelligence investigation. So some of the people, like General Flynn, or we would have liked to have had Mr. Cohen back, once they get tied up in a criminal investigation with Mr. Mueller, we don't have as much access to them. There are clearly tools that Mr. Mueller has in terms of criminal subpoenas and others that we've not used. Most of the members of the Trump orbit, whether quickly or slowly, we've had a chance to interview. There are still things where we've got disagreements, for example, with the old Trump campaign about transition documents, whether they are privileged or not, that we're trying to work through. But we've seen north of 100 witnesses, and we had to look at election security. We finished that part of the report. We're finishing up the concurrence with the intelligence community's assessment of January of 2017. We've got to look a little bit more on what the Obama administration did or didn't do. We've got to look at what we can lay out as policy ideas around social media. And then that last issue will be the issue around collusion.
Is there any indication that the U.S. meddles in Russia's campaigns?
I don't think there has been anything like the level of Russian intervention in our elections. And for that matter, we saw the Russians intervene dramatically in the French elections. There's now been evidence that they have been intervened in the Brexit election. Let's face it, if you can use cyber and use misinformation and disinformation, that is a lot cheaper than buying tanks, trucks, and guns. And we just spent $700 billion on our defense budget in America. Russia spends about $68 billion. Yet in this area of misinformation, disinformation, cyber breaches, hacking into DNC or John Podesta emails and then releasing that information selectively. Russians are pretty darn good.
Is it part of your jurisdiction in the Intelligence Committee to look in to see what the U.S. might be doing or not doing or could be doing vis-a-vis other elections? Is that part of this investigation?
We have oversight over anything the American intelligence community would be doing anywhere around the world.
Is that part of it, or are we just looking sort of at what Russia might have done to us, and are we looking at the flip side?
At where, at least the intelligence community agrees, is we know what Russia has done to us. There's been complete agreement. There's no might involved. We have plenty of evidence. I think the American people recognize and accept that as well. And while a lot of the attention has been on, whether there was collusion or not, and that's important, equally important is we got to make sure this doesn't happen again, because the playbook that the Russians used, other countries could use as well on a going forward basis. And when we saw the vulnerabilities in our state's electoral systems in terms of the ability to hack into systems, when we've seen the ability, and you've even got the leadership of companies like Facebook and Twitter acknowledging they were used by the Russians, the ability to manipulate information. It was the Russians the last time. And believe you me, the Russians simply want to sow dissension as well. So they're not favoring one party over another, but it's a pretty clear guidebook on how other adversaries could attack us as well, and we have to be ready.
You mentioned the special prosecutor, Robert Mueller. He's doing an investigation appointed by the Department of Justice, and he either returns indictments and gets convictions or not. He does a whole different investigation, Senate Intel Committee. What is it that your committee can ultimately do with your findings? What's the sort of the end, when you determine that Russia, you've determined Russia has meddled in our 26th election, what can you do about that? And if you determine there's collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, what can you do?
Well, let's take them one at a time. In terms of election security, we've already laid out bipartisan ideas on how we can upgrade our election security process, how we can make sure that there's better information sharing between the federal government and state and local elections. You touch a lot of parts of our government when you get into elections. How we ought to make sure, for example, that there ought to be paper ballots. So if you got a voting system that's hooked into the internet, is there some kind of paper repository that can't be hacked into, so you've got an ongoing record? How we can make sure that there are appropriate clearances. One of the things the Department of Homeland Security did for a while that I thought was crazy was they wouldn't even tell the reported 21 states that had been at least scanned by the Russians, if not broken into, that they were the subjects of attack because the top election official might not have had appropriate security clearance. That's crazy. Now, they've worked through that, but on a going forward basis, we had a report in, I believe it was April, where Homeland Security acknowledged we still haven't gotten appropriate clearances for all the 150 plus election officials that we need on a going forward basis. So we can have policy and legislative solutions. In the area of social media, there's a lot of us who are thinking through, over half of Americans get their news from Facebook. Should there be some of the same responsibilities put on Facebook or some of these other social media platform companies that TV and newspapers and radio ought to rely on? Are there other policy solutions around identity validation so that if somebody says they're Greta, but it's actually another body with just your face on it, it's called the next generation of technology, deep fake technology. How do we make sure that people aren't going to be manipulated and dealt with differently in the future? We're still trying to get our arms around 2016 technology where somebody says they're Greta, but it's actually Boris in St. Petersburg creating some site that may not have anything to do with politics, but lures Americans in, misrepresents, and then they seed political information. That'll get more even prevalent when you start to move and actually have a streaming video of somebody that appears to be somebody that's not that person. So there's policy ramifications that come out of that. So we do the policy piece, the legislative piece. Mr. Mueller will take on the criminal charge.
You mentioned Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg, who's the head of Facebook, was here on Capitol Hill and basically said he's sorry and he'll try to do better. Was that enough for you? Not
enough for me. I mean, when Mr. Zuckerberg and some of the senior folks in Facebook, when I first raised these issues in December of 16, he said that he thought it was crazy idea that Russia could have used Facebook. Well, a few months later, they acknowledged they absolutely had.
Do you think he knew before when he said that?
I don't believe so. I hope not. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. And Facebook has moved. They're working with our committee now. They're trying to make sure that if someone is buying political advertising on Facebook, that there has to be some disclosure, the same way there's disclosure on TV and radio. I think they need to do more in terms of identity validation around political advertising. I think they've got more to work to do with us in the Congress in terms of questions around, some level of content review, and it's hard. I mean, Mr. Zuckerberg came and testified not before our committee, and I think the vast majority of Americans, for the most part, saw how ignorant most or uninformed most senators were about even how social media works. And my appeal to Facebook, to Twitter, to Google, to all of these social media companies is work with us on a solution, because if Congress comes in, this has nothing to do with Democrat or Republican, but if Congress comes in and tries to do it on our own without some advice and technology advice, my background was in technology, so I'm hopefully a little bit further along the learning curve, that we will probably get it wrong.
We're getting a new CIA director. It looks like the vote will be the end of the week, and that it looks like she will be confirmed. When the acting director, who will soon be director, I assume, Haspel testified, she did not condemn the enhanced interrogation or torture, whatever term we're going to use for this. She didn't condemn it. Then in a letter to you, she said she did condemn it. Did that bother you, that between the public testimony and the letter that she changed her mind?
Well, Gina Haspel, 33-year veteran of the CIA. She's been acting director and assistant director for the last year plus. I've had a lot of opportunity to work with her. She's been straightforward, but she's also lived her whole life as a spy. So the idea that when she first came to testify, I was disappointed in her answers, because the person that I knew, the person that I'd had private conversations with and others, was more forthcoming about what her view of the interrogation program was now. Listen, I understand that she wanted to protect the people who were involved in that program, and that she may have believed differently at the time in the aftermath of 9/11, but on a going forward basis, I felt it was necessary for me to, particularly if I was going to vote for her, and I will be voting for her, is that she needs to make clear what she views on a going forward basis about this program, and also to make sure that she would be willing to refuse an order from Mr. Trump if it was against the law or, in her view, immoral, and I think torture falls into those categories.
But she wouldn't say it at the hearing, and she had plenty of time to think of it. And I think the assumption is that she didn't want to offend probably her colleagues in the CIA. And two things, like, why did she suddenly get the courage in a letter to you? Did that disturb you? And secondly, if she won't stand up to her colleagues, what makes you think she'll stand up to the president if, for instance, she got an order that was not legal?
The senior intelligence leaders from both the Obama administration and the Trump administration all strongly support her, number one. Number two, I think the vast majority of the intelligence community, rank and file, support her as well, and are really worried that, particularly with this president and his erratic behavior, he might appoint someone that's a pure political appointee.
But he appointed Pompeo.
And listen, and I voted for Mike Pompeo. I was concerned. He assured me, and I think he operated the CIA in a pretty darn good way. But in terms of Ms. Haspel, I think it was really important for her, because her job now is not just to protect and have the support of the CIA, but to recognize now in a public role, and she's never been public in anything in her life. 30 of the last 33 years she's been undercover. So I maybe cut her a little bit of slack in terms of this first public hearing that she's ever been in. I think she has to, I made the point to her, based upon what I'd heard from her, I was comfortable, but she needed to make sure that that message got out, and she chose to do it in a letter, and that met my criteria. But I also know it was a hard decision. I absolutely understand why the vast majority of the Democrats decided not to support her.
One of the things that she is in her history as a member of the CIA is that she was in Thailand overseeing the interrogation, enhanced interrogation, torture of at least one person associated with 9/11. Those documents are classified. So I don't know what they say. I don't know if you know what they say, but I don't know what they say. She, as acting director, could declassify that so that we could have more transparency and see exactly what she did participate in, didn't participate in, so we can be fair to her in either way. Should she declassify those so the rest of us can see?
Listen, I wish, particularly in some of her background when she was back here based in Washington, there would be more declassification. But when she's posted abroad, it's not just about her life. It's about also other agents that are serving our country. And I think it is important to protect sources and methods. Same way in the intelligence world as in the law enforcement world. We're asking these folks to protect our nation.
Even if it's illegal conduct, even if it now everyone, I mean, I guess it was legal then. Now not to be legal now. I mean, it's a gray area.
Greta, that's a fairly big distinction, I think, in a lot of the minds of the people who were at that point operating at least with the notion that this was something they'd been ordered to do by the president and it had legal opinions. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to hear from her that even if this president says, I want to restart this kind of program, and listen, he's been out publicly saying he thought waterboarding maybe made some sense, which I completely disagree with. All the intelligence community professionals now and all the defense community officials now think that is not the right way. I wanted to make sure she would be strong enough to say if she got that kind of order, particularly from this president, that she would refuse it. She also made that clear as well in the letter to me.
All right, I obviously haven't seen the documents because they're classified, and I got that you think they shouldn't be declassified, but as a senator on a Senate Intelligence Committee, have you seen those documents and are you satisfied so that at least you can represent for the rest of us who can't see them?
Well, I've seen the documents, and there's certain documents that simply goes with the responsibility of being on the Senate Intelligence Committee. But many of the documents, many of the allegations that have been made about some of her past postings, all the senators, regardless of whether they're on the Intelligence Committee or not, got a chance to look at those.
And they get to vote, and they get to vote.
And they get to vote.